Good afternoon, at least for many of you. Good morning, good evening to others. My name is Dan Cederbaum, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. We hope that all of you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Kaplan Center's first program of the new year 5781. Rabbi Steve Guto and Rabbi Dr. Rachel Shabbat Beit Halachmi, in conversation with me, on Is Jewish Life Meaningless Without Jewish Law, a small topic. So we have two rabbis, two lawyers, and a PhD in Jewish philosophy, all in three people. I want to thank the SAJ, Judaism That Stands for All, for co-sponsoring this event, as they do a number of often. At the risk of boring those of you who've heard this once too many times, but there are new people on the call, the meeting. The Kaplan Center was organized at the end of 2010 and is based in Evanston, Illinois. It is a not-for-profit organization devoted to the transformation of Jewish community through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century. The Kaplan Center's perspective is explicitly trans-denominational. I want to acknowledge my Kaplan Center colleagues. I've seen so far, obviously, Mel Skult, our co-founder and vice president, as well as board member Jane Susswine, and I am not seeing necessarily everybody, so I'll pick up on anybody else I've not acknowledged later. Before turning to today's important program, I want to talk a little bit about future programs, some of which you just heard a little about. So first, next Monday evening, November 2nd, I'll be sending something out later today, the first of a number of book parties, if you will, book talks with our colleague Mel Skult on the occasion of the publication of volume 3 of Communings of the Spirit, the wonderfully edited extensive excerpts with commentary from Mordechai Kaplan's diaries, this one covering the years, I'm not looking at it, Mel, but I think it's 1942 to 1951. There will be other diary programs as well, and we'll try to keep you apprised of those. The music of the SAJ, the next program in our SAJ Centenary service that I know many people were looking forward to, has been postponed because of COVID issues, and we're likely going to do that in the spring. That'll focus, but not exclusively, on Cantor Moshe Nathanson, as well as all the other wonderful music associated with that important synagogue. Also, looking way ahead, but it's right off the press, we are delighted to be partnering with Hebrew College and Hadar on a conference that'll take place October 24 to 25 in 2021. We hope in the Boston area, if COVID permits. That will be titled Building Jewishly Literate Communities, and there's going to be a lot more coming out soon about that. Do check out the wonderful educational visioning materials on our website, thanks to Rabbis Jeffrey Schein and Aaron Hirsch and their team. And it's already been brought up indirectly today, video and written archives of what I think, frankly, was a pretty great theology conference in September will soon be available. I've put up and I'll keep doing it, my email address down at kaplancenter.org. You can use that to ask questions. I will try to monitor my email as well as I can as we go. Even better is to use the chat, preferably chat to me privately. Again, those of you who've done this before with us know how this goes, but I'll repeat the ground rules. Questions, please put in chat to me privately. General comments you'd like people to see, you're welcome to post in chat to everyone, or rhetorical questions sometimes get posted there as well. And we'll integrate questions into the program as best I can as we move along. I will turn lawyer for a moment, as I always do at this point. We are video recording this program. If you are uncomfortable with that, you of course need not stay on, or you can turn off your video. You're asking a question or otherwise speaking will be deemed to constitute consent to our recording of what you say. And again, recordings of almost all of our programs are or will soon be available on the Kaplan Center website. So, as I said in some of the publicity materials, I'm really delighted to be here with two of my favorite liberal Jewish thought leaders, Steve Guto and Rachel Shabbat Beit Halachmi, and I'm going to turn things over to them for their introductory remarks in just a moment, but by way of a little bit of further framing. So the provocative title, intentionally provocative, is Jewish Law, Meaningless Without Jewish Law, comes, as many of you know, pretty much directly from one of Kaplan's most important books, The Future of the American Jew, published in 1948. For him, and we will get in a little bit to the nuances of his answer, but the blunt answer is yes, Jewish life ultimately is meaningless without Jewish law. And we're going to talk a bit today, of course, about what we mean exactly by Jewish law. Is that somehow different from halacha? Is that somehow different from halacha with a capital Hey or H, and therefore perhaps different from halacha with a small hey or H? I want to make clear at the outset, what we are not here to do today is talk about, in any form, the question, who is a good Jew? This is not about individual observance of mitzvot, however one defines mitzvot. At least that's not the intention of our program to talk, if at all, much about that. Moreover, what we're primarily interested today in, and certainly Kaplan was, is what we call interpersonal mitzvot, those that are ben adam lachavero, to the extent they can be isolated that way. Although sometimes they intersect, I think, importantly, with so-called ritual commandments, those ben adam lamakom. I think the obvious one in my case, and I always emphasize it because it's very important to me in real communities, is the case of the Shiva minyanim. Again, where I think one's obligations horizontally, if you will, toward members of the community, particularly those in mourning, sort of intersect with the ritual issues around saying Kaddish and holding minions in a Shiva home. And so that the question there, of course, being to what extent should people feel that it's more than a nice idea or a nice suggestion to make sure that a mourner wishing or feeling the need to say Kaddish will always know that there is a minyan. That's just one example. I think it's also important as we go on to keep in mind a very important distinction, I think, between individual decision-making regarding any form of practice, particularly ritual practice on the one hand, and communal norms on the other. And then, of course, lurking behind this, the very fraught question of enforcement authority. So the case I point to here, just to kick things off, but I don't expect either Rachel or Steve to comment on this unless they want to, is the case of Kaplan and his talit katan, the tzitzit that he wore, as Mel has discussed. This is a pretty famous diary entry, pretty much throughout his life, as I understand it, at least his adult life. And the question of why he did that. He may well have felt a strong sense of obligation, but not, quote, because God said so, close quotes, and not in a way that he believed a community should seek to compel, for sure, as Mal always reminds me. But I do think it's important to consider to what extent that, again, is more about a strong sense of the term obligation, or the notion of obligation in a strong sense, and not just about a preference or a purely autonomous choice based on learning. So with that long-winded introduction, Rachel is going to kick things off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And Steve, it's a delight to have this opportunity to teach and learn with you. Welcome, everyone. I am so honored to be part of the Kaplan Center in these ways and many more. This is a question that we're asking today is at the core of a lot of the work that I've done over the last couple of decades, actually, on this question from a liberal perspective when it comes to particular theologians. Certainly Kaplan, who I've been writing about a great deal in the last few years, thanks to Mel Sculp's beautifully edited volumes. The third one just arrived the last few days, Mel. It's so exciting to actually hold it in our hands. I encourage everyone to have that pleasure. And I just love how these volumes are dedicated to your brother who is with us here. Your most significant, how do you frame it? I don't have the book in front of me, Alan, you're his most significant critic, I think, Chavruta. Oh, Alan's on mute.
Yeah, he's on mute. Sorry, we'll get to it.
Okay. Well, that'll come out. At any rate, I say that because, Mel, I think it's very powerful how Dan and the Kaplan Center writ large has invited all of us into this chavruta with these living questions. One of the reasons that I find this so powerful to discuss now is that I think really Jewish thought is at a new turning point on this question. All of the denominations, in as much as we think about the movements, various movements that many of us here represent different ones and are involved in different ones in different ways, are really struggling with this same question and have answered it differently over time. So just as an introduction, Dan, I want to make sure I'm not overstepping my introduction, but I'll be referring to and focusing on not so much Kaplan, but really focusing on how these questions have been thought about by major thinkers who are primarily identified with Reform Judaism, in particular Eugene B. Borowitz of blessed memory and Leo Baeck.
Yep.
Do we want Steve to make an introduction or should I dive in?
No, just go dive in. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm diving.
Although before you do, Mel tells us it's my most significant philosophical other, my brother Alan.
Oh.
There it is. So for the
Thank you. I appreciate that we now have that on record as we should. So the question from a perspective in terms of Reform thought is something that really has shifted over the years. I would say even very dramatically. In different phases of the development of Reform Judaism, there have been very different stances on this notion. But what I would like to suggest at the outset is that the answer throughout all of these periods of time is, I think, very much along the lines and aligns well with Kaplan's answer to this question. The next sentence has to be, of course, as Dan framed it for us, what does that mean? What is Jewish law? And of course, who defines it and how is it lived? And what is the role of what Borowitz will call the autonomous Jewish self in that question? So Dan, I think it's very helpful that you tried to delineate some of the questions we're answering and not answering. But what I will say is for Reform thinkers, all of those questions are always at the fore when you say that, say halacha with a capital H or law with a capital L. I will say serving a conservative synagogue now, I think those questions also come to bear whenever somebody says, well, it's our minhag, whether or not they're speaking about law, about practice, or a nice suggestion. So I want to share, if I can, just a few frames of what I think is key in terms of the way Reform thinkers over time have thought about it, focusing on Eugene Borowitz. And it will take me just a moment to share this PowerPoint. So I'll say a few words about Borowitz as we dive in here. Hopefully give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Yes, okay, wonderful. So as we dive in, this question of what makes Jewish life meaningful and what the role of law is has actually been at the heart of how Reform theologians and thinkers have been dealing with it. In fact, you could even say that this question is the cause, and maybe even a primal cause, if I could be so dramatic, of Reform Judaism, which is to actually redefine the meaning of Jewish life through a redefinition of Jewish law. And redefining not only what Jewish law is, but what its role and its authority is at different times and in different places. So focusing on North America, because this question plays itself out differently in different areas, but if we focus on North America, I wanted to bring us to this question that is really how most Reform thinkers, really since the 1940s until today, literally until today, think about this question, which is are we talking about law as governance, or as guidance. And that becomes Freehoff, who is one of the major halachic thinkers in the Reform movement, and is even the name on the think tank of the Reform movement that thinks about these questions of halacha, not the CCR Responsa Committee, which is another body, but this is a separate organization that is the Freehoff Institute. Freehoff was very significant thinker and rabbi. Some of you may have heard of him, but he was amongst a number of rabbis that thinkers and rabbis and leaders that wrestled with this question of what is Jewish law and what is its role in a meaningful life. So he says, and this becomes kind of the theme question, governance or guidance. For all of you lovers of and people who are so steeped in Kaplan's work, this to me sounds an awful lot like, does, a question that leads to a similar Kaplanian answer, which is Jewish law having a vote, but not a veto. And I know that I'm taking that out of context, and there's lots of thinking about and different interpretations of the context and what he meant by that and what we should understand by that. But that has really been an alignment for Reform thinkers in the same period. But what you see here in this quote that I bring to you from a CCAR journal in 1941 is that Freehoff is saying that he's very concerned about, he's very concerned about creating a code of Jewish law and how it will work. Primarily, his concern is that he doesn't want to do, this is a rabbinic, Talmudic rabbinic concern, really from the moment or a biblical concern about law, that from the moment that Moses brings down the revelation, that creates a community of sinners. Right, that by definition, bringing law that obligates people, that will create a community of those who are failing, who are over, who are trespassing. And it seems that Freehoff is articulating here the same kind of concern that we have, which is why Moses, right, Moshe Rabbeinu smashes those first set of tablets. The people weren't ready to uphold them, and we could say so much more about that moment. But in a modern context, creating an American, a firmly rooted, more developed American Judaism, really during and after the Second World War, this same question exists. If there's a move to create a code, that's the context, there's a move among actually Felix Levy and other rabbis to discuss whether or not they should respond to this desire to create a code. But then he asked this question, what about Shabbat? Do we have an agreement about how to handle that? We couldn't dare omit them. What shall we permit and what shall we prohibit? And he's also very aware of something that I want to bring into the conversation, which is here. Very concerned that what they say as a body on Jewish law will bitterly offend the Orthodox, who will see us as legalizing our negligence, right? And at the same time, we're also aware that we may be offending our own conscience because we will be giving legal status, right, to things that in fact we believe that there should be more of a individual role in determining. And also the recognition, this is in 1941, that whatever role we give to law, liberal Judaism is in fact, has largely, or rather there have been large swaths of Jewish law that liberal Jews don't want to bring into effect again as law. Okay, you see the set of problems. Lewis Jacobs puts it another way, which is that we're sifting through Jewish law. We're holding Jewish law as guidance and governance, but we are choosing in three ways: that which must be discarded because it is one of two things. These are the categories of the way liberal thinkers have been thinking about Jewish law in this mode. either there are three categories. One is that there are laws that are so ethically problematic that they must be put aside, right? And for liberal thinkers, the first example is usually the legal status of an aguna, for example, a wife chained to a husband that she wants to divorce so that she can remarry, and the refusal to give that woman a get. So that's one of the first things that comes to mind. And this brings up a deep question for liberal thinkers about halakha, is that yes, we want halakha, but we don't want halakha that is in conflict with our deepest ethical sensibilities and our conscience in a very Kantian, Herman Cohen view of what that means. And so there's a deep desire and a deep understanding that there's going to be that category of laws. There's another category of laws, which I would call, essentially parv. They're not deeply offensive to other values and moral principles that we have, but they're meaningless. And the first example usually brought in that category is shatnez, right? It may have once had deep meaning, but don't see it as a spiritual experience to go have our jackets checked to be sure that they do or don't have a mix of linen and wool. That's the second category, the not problematic for our conscience, but not relevant. And then there's the third category that we want to uplift and see it as much more than guidance. And those are basic laws, understood in new context, the new American context of, let's say, Shabbat, ceremonial laws about ceremonies. I find it fascinating that around issues of burial, Dan, you made me think of this, and of course we're dealing with a lot of, tragically, a lot of burials these days, how much we uphold lots of the legal halachic requirements about that, we liberal rabbis. And certainly, as you said, around mourning. When it comes to personal status, we have the major issue, defining issue there, of course, is the issue of gender when it comes to ethics and personal status. Before I jump forward, Dan, and focus on the work of Borowitz in this realm, should I pause for questions?
Nothing in yet. Let me stop to take this opportunity again to encourage people to post questions to me, ideally me privately, in the chat to everyone for public comments. And also, if you promise to be well-behaved when I call on you, you can also ask to be called on. But for the moment, long-winded would say one should keep going, Rachel.
Okay, wonderful. I'm honored to do so. So what we're looking at here, this is a photo of Dr. Eugene Borowitz, who's one of the major thinkers and commentators on the way in which Reform rabbis as a collective, the CCAR, have understood law, which means, as many of you may know, there's a different, the conference of rabbis have platforms, and over the ages, they've viewed law in different ways. And Borowitz has been one of the, since 1976, with the centennial perspective of the CCAR on these questions of law and what he will call a capacious pluralism. Borowitz has been one of the, if not the thinkers on these issues from a liberal perspective. I use his term freedom in covenant to really to describe his theology when it comes to law. The covenantal obligations for him are both theological and legal. In fact, he concludes his major work on Jewish theology called Renewing the Covenant, a theology for the postmodern Jew, a theology, not the theology, but a theology for a postmodern Jew, published in 1991. and was actually translated a few years ago into Hebrew. And I was delighted to write the introduction to that Hebrew volume. So this idea of freedom in covenant is precisely that tension that is in the description of our program, both acknowledging the what earlier Reform thinkers called autonomy, and he will call limited, he will really understand it as a personal autonomy limited in a way by being Jewish. So the Jewish autonomous self is in covenant with the kind of freedom that we know is necessary for the liberal Jew on one hand, and yet it is also, he understands it as something that needs to be limited. But what happens at the end of renewing the covenant that confirms that this is a legalistic way of thinking is that he focuses the test of his covenant theology. The test of his covenant theology is a legal test. What would this look like in practice? And he calls the people able to determine, right, what falls into this category of covenantal theology in practice. He calls them poskim. Right, a liberal posek is one that does, we can discuss it in a while if we have time, but actually goes through a process, a legal set of considerations in addition to theological ones about whether or not one is fulfilling that covenant. He's criticized, of course, by scholars along the way, many scholars whose responses to that work of theology can be found in a volume called Reviewing the Covenant, right? His volume was called Renewing. Peter Oakes collected a number of articles in a volume called Reviewing the Covenant. And the main argument with Borowitz is, why does he use the term duty, right? Or responsibility or covenantal obligation? Why doesn't he just say mitzvah and halacha? And those decisions, which are not just stylistic and not just, verbal, linguistic decisions, they actually represent the extent to which he knew that the way of including law in Jewish life from a liberal perspective in the second half of the 20th century was precisely to do it with a new vocabulary. And so that's where we arrive at covenant theology, which is both theology and a halachic context. I want to root what I think Borowitz and other legal thinkers liberal legal thinkers are doing in this very famous Talmudic passage. Won't hurt us to study a little bit of Talmud today, and it's one that's probably familiar to many of you, which is the story of the mountain being held over the heads of the Israelites. It comes to us in Bavli Masechet Shabbat, and it's the source, a great Talmudic source on this question altogether about Jewish life with and without law. And I believe that Borowitz is essentially engaged in this question that this Talmudic passage leaves us with. So in short, this will be the shortest review of this text ever, but I'm assuming that many of you know it. It's a midrashic commentary essentially on the verse in Exodus where the Israelites are gathering at the foothills of the mountain, right? So they're gathering at the foothill of a mountain. They're gathered around I don't know if you can see this cup, like I'm just using this as a visual aid. They're gathered at the foothills, and it says they're at betachtit har. They hear in that the root tachat, right? From being, are you at the foothills or are you mitachat? Are you underneath the mountain? And this teaches us, of course, that milamed shekafah kadosh baruch hu alehem et har kegigit. And God says to them while the mountain's being held over their heads, right? And Heschel and Levinas and so many thinkers bring this in the same context that we're in. God holds the mountain over their heads and says to them, great, you accept my Torah, great. Ve'im lav, and if not, there will be your burial place. I'm going to jump forward to where this Talmudic text leaves us, which is, did we or did we not voluntarily enter into this obligation with the Torah? Different rabbinic opinions, but essentially they leave us with what I believe Borowitz and Kaplan or others are doing, which is this idea that perhaps then there wasn't total acceptance of that obligation, but later, and the rabbis here brings us the biblical proof text from the book of Esther, right? Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. Later in time, in another place, in another context, we will be affirming our obligation to that law. And this, I believe, is at the core of this conversation for Borowitz, for Beck, for Kaplan, and certainly in many ways for Heschel and for other thinkers, that we are not at Sinai. We're not in the story of Purim. We are in, and for Heschel, it was the experience of World War II, that the mountain is held over our heads, and that in every age, we are called to renew the covenant, as Borowitz puts it. But to find, what I will say in our conversation is to find a new place for Jewish law, and to understand that it has to have a place in order for there to be a meaningful Jewish existence. I will pause there because I think I've put an awful lot on the table for us to consider about this question. But it all really is rooted on this question of how do we resolve that tension? And what I believe Borowitz does over a lifetime is he essentially is arguing for these hyphens, which is that it is a tension, a dichotomy even, that is not meant to be resolved, but meant to be lived.
Great. Good questions are coming in. I'm going to try to save the broader framework questions for after Steve's opening presentation, but let me just interject before he does that a couple of comments or questions from the audience. So I'm going to paraphrase, so I apologize if the questioner doesn't like the paraphrase. Jane Susswine is wondering, in terms of your discussion of what I'll call flashpoints issues in Jewish law, you said specifically gender, and she's wondering, I think, if that's really shorthand for a variety of issues around both gender and sexual orientation, sexual status, transgender issues. And all
the answer to that is so quick, I want to answer it and say, yes, absolutely. All of that and then some.
Right. Next, Manny Solon raises an important question that we should put explicitly on the table, I think, which is when we start categorizing Jewish law into parv and, perhaps irrelevant and perhaps shocking to the conscience, those sorts of categories, aren't we creating a divide that can't be overcome between liberal Jews and Orthodox or so-called halakhically? There is, for those who don't know, it's category day of halakhically traditional small group that's beginning to distinguish themselves from Orthodoxy. But in any case, let's call it halakhically traditional Jews on the one hand and liberal Jews on the other. And is that a problem?
Can I respond to that now?
Yes, that's the idea.
Okay. So first of all, excellent questions. The first one, yes. And I will say that Borowitz himself as a thinker, when I say gender, that actually for him didn't apply to all those categories that you mentioned, and then some that are emerging now. In fact, one of the major questions on one of the HUC campuses is this question of how does Judaism respond to a world in which queer Jews are not at the fringes, but are actually the center and are the rabbinic leaders, and how does our law and practice respond to that? But in Borowitz's day, the big questions that he considers to be in that category of gender have to do with the full equality of women as rabbis, as witnesses, right, as everything, in a way that the conservative movement was, shall we say, slower to recognize. But Borowitz, actually until the last decade of his life, did not believe that openly gay and lesbian rabbinic students, that the gay and lesbian people should not become rabbis and should not be ordained. And in fact, those who were out about it at HUC in the early years, he didn't sign their smicha documents. Our smichas, right, are signed by, a dozen or so or more of the professors on our campus who teach us. In fact, one of them from our LA campus I noted was here. And your signatures, I will say, Bill, your signatures mean everything about the authority of that smicha, of that klaf, of that document that gives us rabbinic authority. And Borowitz, for some time, didn't sign those. And in later years, well, I could tell more story about that. In later years, he decided that his commitment to not signing it was based on his erroneous assumption, in his own words, his erroneous assumption that they could not lead ideal Jewish lives and have families, that wasn't going to be a priority. But of course, he learned over time that in fact, many of our colleagues and human beings who are not, heteronormative in that way are, raising the most beautiful, observant, wonderful families, more so than a lot of our hetero colleagues. So, and forgive me for those old school terms, but that is how it was discussed at the time. So he understood, though, that a legal system, and this is important to add to the debate, he had actually a very interesting set of exchanges, not only with Elliot Dorff and others from the conservative, the Committee of Law and Standards, but he had an ongoing dialogue with Aaron Lichtenstein, really the representative of modern Orthodox halachic thinking in his time of these questions. And he has a beautiful essay about the extent to which he understands that liberal Jews cannot be halachic Jews because halakha, as it's understood from an Orthodox perspective, right, halakha with a capital H that goes with that capital O of Orthodoxy, is, he didn't say, not moral, but he said it's amoral system, a system that doesn't have a meta ethic that can assure us that there won't be unethical consequences, is a system that you can't say is absolutely a moral system if it doesn't have a way of handling all of these moral questions. So not unmoral, but amoral. And I think that that's important to put on the table as well.
Great, and we'll come back to the bigger picture issues, I promise, after Steve talks. What I left implicit in my opening remarks is that the relatively detailed biographical material was included in the publicity for the program. As always, we're saving time by not going into the wonderful bios of both each of our speakers. I will just note that in case it wasn't obvious, Rachel is the rabbi PhD person, Steve is the rabbi lawyer person, and with that, Rabbi Steve Guto.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Rachel. It was a wonderful experience being with you, both of you. And Rachel, it was great to hear you talk about, how halakha is thought from the religious hierarchies of the 20th century and into the 21st century. It's not what I'm going to look at. When I was asked to do this, and I know Dan and Rachel know because we had a conversation. I would not even name this as Jewish life meaningless without Jewish law. I know many Jews feel that it is. For me, however, the answer is an unequivocal no. I think Jews they're very meaningful Jews without Jewish law or even knowing what it is. And I also think there are a lot more Jews who have no idea what halakha is and aren't really interested in learning about it. However, there are ideas, unifying ideas that I think they'll embrace. Rather than law or halakha, terms which convey a certain rigidity, I will argue that a value-based, flexible, and autonomous Judaism is more responsive to the reality of Jewish life today. And I want to focus on this idea. That's what I want to talk about. How can we build Jewish life today? What can we make it bigger, broader, deeper, and where does halakha stand in that? I don't think it has to have a place, but I think it probably does. Since I'm a Reconstructionist rabbi, and since Dan asked me to do this, I'm going to begin by speaking of Reconstructionist decision-making, which is a little different than Reform decision-making, at least traditionally, which includes how our individuals and communities determine their practice of Judaism in their homes and in their synagogues. And we don't call our process law. There are basic, and most of you are many of you are Reconstructionists, so you know this already, but there are basic Jewish and community values which pervade in the different communities, but little is ordered, must do by the national bodies. The idea is that each community makes its own decisions by deep consideration of Jewish and other values and Jewish history. There are few, if any, mandated laws. We still use the old Reconstructionists, which Raquel used also. Aphorisms, which include the past has a vote but not a veto. This she didn't use. God is the power that makes for salvation, and other early basic statements. The movement clearly has changed some over the years in the areas of marriage, limitations on who can be a rabbi, but not that much. Even when I became a rabbi in 2003, the role of the rabbi was still thought to be more of a facilitator and mediator and repository of Jewish and general knowledge and principles. It's basically what I was taught in rabbinical school. I wasn't really able to live rabbinically that way. So more and more the rabbi has now become a guide and a leader. And although there are now many issues on which positions are taken by reconstructing Judaism, the name of both the college and the movement and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, there is significant respect given to the decisions of the individual communities, which are basically independent of the national bodies. And they're part of them, but they're independent of them. There's no Reconstructionist law, but there are values which seem to be consistent throughout the movement: social justice, egalitarianism, a deep commitment to ritual, and a broad understanding of the role of the deity in the tradition, but it's broad. These values, which are not mandated from the top, and I'm only naming a few, are generally the basis of Reconstructionist decision-making, both locally and nationally. I think there are differences between us, and that's one of the things Dan asked me to look at, and Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism really began with the idea that the halakhic manifestations of ethics were at a far higher place than the ritual and other ones. And I don't think Reconstructionist Judaism had any hierarchies, because halakha in that way wasn't part of what we were taught. It was more top-down decision-making than in Reconstructionism, but they're all very close. And I think that's, it can lead to differences that don't have that much meaning. Hold on, I'm gonna let somebody in. I don't know who it is. So as I discuss my views regarding Jewish law, as if it were law in progressive Judaism, you're going to be able to discern my Reconstructionist understanding is in play. But I want to be honest with all of you, those that know me and those that don't yet. It comes from who I am, my understanding and belief in the value of autonomy and what I've studied over the years. And it's really about what I think can build a Judaism for the future, and where halakha sits in that Judaism. As a Jew from Texas, I can talk like one who has traveled the world and meeting all stripes of Jews in just about as many countries as you can envision. The idea that there could be mandated laws or halakha defining progressive Judaism sounds unlikely, and to me, personally, not appealing. I do think, though, that today's topic is valuable and worth discussing, because this conversation may help us find which values matter most to us as liberal Jews. And I do believe, as I learned from my friend and teacher, David Teutsch, that values-based decision-making is probably, oh my God, there's stuff going on, the best we got. The search for a Holocaust for the 21st century will help us learn more about each other and what is most important and essential to us as Jews. This search will help us stay together as Jews, not only in the United States, but all over the world. So there's a role for Holocaust. If I were to narrow the focus as to what are my foundational points today, there are three main ones. Number one, what are our values? What are the values of Jews in America today? And maybe around the world, but let's just say to America, and how can they be enhanced by halakhic thinking? That's my experience. That's what I'm doing. Underlying this, the whole thing's about basic values. That's what I think. How does God figure into this discussion? And number three, what is the meaning, value, and limits, if there are any, of autonomy? So I want to start first with number three, autonomy. Non-halakhic Jews include the vast majority of Jews in America, probably more than 85% of us. I think the autonomy question matters in our ability to nuance the possible responses to proposed Jewish laws. Oh, that's it. Okay. Will tell us a lot about how to best help the Jewish world stay together and to grow our people deeply and even possibly broadly in terms of numbers. I speak as a liberal Jew who takes our people and its culture, and always has, very seriously, loves God in the way I experience God, which I'll tell you a little bit later, but also has little willingness to suggest that Judaism should limit our autonomy. I do want to put limits to that. For me, and I imagine most Jews, Jewish Christians fit in that tiny spectrum in which autonomy should not control. I do not think of them as Jews. I also think, and I've had a lot of arguments because I'm close to a lot of evangelical Christians around the country because of the work I do. And they don't understand how some of the other things I say about Judaism would say that you couldn't believe in Christ and be Jewish, and you just can't. I do not think, I also think that automatic lineage, such as Judaism comes from the mother, or even in some places the father, trumps autonomy, at least for me. There should be an automatic lineage law. And also, well, there are other things too, but not too many. But not too, among progressive Jews, autonomy is the prevailing winner. And I think we are on shaky ground if we do not keep that principle front and center. Once one group begins to limit autonomy, who is to say that another group does not have the same privileges and other things get limited? I'm a good Jew and I don't believe in that. I'm a good, anyway, we must do this. To avoid, because it informs my thinking, to add, because it informs my thinking on the subject, I have taught Jewish law and its interface with American law in both seminars at a university setting when I was a rabbi in St. Louis and in my synagogue here and as a lawyer. I found this teaching, and this is a journey that not only invigorates my appreciation for halakha, my understanding of how halakhic thinking can and sometimes, and this is going to be surprising to some of you, influences the laws of this country in certain states. But most importantly for this talk, one of the many ways we can help traditional halakha become more important in our individual lives. Because if we understand who we are as Jews, and as lawyers would understand themselves, when I've taught lawyers, which I have, they become excited about this. But I think there's other places where we can bring halakha into the mix and help people become better, more engaged in Judaism, because they say, oh, that came from the past. That's great. Rather than first trying to create an explanation of what binds us as Jews, I feel it's far more important that we learn what are our moral, religious, and political essentials for progressive Jews today. If we do not first go to our people, we may just be flapping our wings. If we don't go to who are you? What motivates you, man? What motivates you, sir? I looked carefully at the 2016 publication by the by the Pew Forum, comparing Israeli Jews and American Jews. This, the part about American Jews that I'm going to quote was taken in 2013. And it consisted, those of you that know much about polls, of over 3,400 Jews. In dividing within each group the different opinions they did between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews. So if we knew the values of Jews today as they are, and we can find values within Judaism that support those values, that seems to me a good place to start using Jewish law as part of the teaching the connection between the values we take seriously and their connection to Judaism, not making the values into halakha, but using halakhic thinking to help undergird the values. I'm hoping this makes sense to you, but we can talk about it later. Somebody wants to get in. Oh, I didn't. Okay. As I said a minute ago, non-Orthodox Jews make up at least 85% of the Jews in America. I'm about to run through some statistics, kind of a lot of them, that probably explain the meaning of Judaism to American Jews better than trying to start with halakha and make today's progressive Jews fit in. I don't think that's in an autonomous culture. That is the best starting place. I think we should say, who are you? Where are you? What do you want? What are you thinking? What means something to you about Judaism? From that survey, here are a litany of statistics. They reflect our values, I guess, as Jews. When it comes to non-Orthodox Jews, and remember this includes Reform Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, conservative Jews, and unaffiliated people, 20% of us think religion is very important in our lives. That's not so much, but very important is a lot more think feel comfortable in their Jewishness. 65% of us eat pork, probably like it, I don't know. 34% of us fast all day on Yom Kippur, and joyously, 66% of us participate in Passover Seders. Most of us, including the Orthodox, of 58% have college degrees. That's a lot for any group in America. Among the non-Orthodox, 94% of us are proud to be Jewish. So that's, may not be the most important thing, but they're proud of it. 73% feel a strong sense of belonging to our Jewish people. And 60% of us think we have to take care of Jews in need. So there are some really important positives that we can look at. When it comes to Jewish identity, 50% of those of us who are married, this is among progressive Jews, are married to non-Jewish spouses. That makes some parts of halakha very difficult to promote in those families, if you think about it. And only 27% of us say that most of our friends are Jewish. I don't know who the people on this call, but only 27% say that. Last, when it comes to ethics and justice and what is essential, that's the word they use, to being Jewish, and these numbers come from all American Jews, which is kind of exciting, some of them are, because they're coming from Orthodox and the non-Orthodox Jews. 73% include remembering that pandemic of death, that's my word, pandemic, I'm just using it, the Holocaust. 69% say leading an ethical and moral life. That's essential to being Jewish. That's how they see it. Only 19% say observing Jewish law. Now, I want you to remember that in that 19% are the Orthodox. So it's only 9% probably if they just didn't, in those value things, they didn't divide the Orthodox out and the liberal Jews from the Orthodox. Hold on. Because I think all the Orthodox would say it's essential. 43% say living in or caring about Israel matters. 56% say working for equality and justice matter. 14% say eating Jewish food, and no surprise here, 42% say having a good sense of humor is essential. So that's, these are not deeply religious Jews in general. If we want to create a covenant of values and principles under which we can bring progressive Jews into a stronger connection to their Judaism, rather than use the term Jewish law, which only 19% of American Jews, including the Orthodox, accept as a primary descriptor, why not use those beliefs which animate us as a people and find a way, why don't we start where we are and to make these values a covenant or an umbrella of our faith? Teaching in a time where autonomy is a pervasive and pretty unquestioned value, why not go to where our people are and try to engage them on a platform that they may value more? I'm wondering, I don't know, Raquel, I wonder what Borowitz would say about this. I don't know. He was such a great thinker, and today's a lot different than I think when he was really right. I know he lived into the 21st century, but still, I don't know. Before I move towards closing, I want to bring God into the equation. According to Pew, only 26% of non-Orthodox Jews believe in God with absolute certainty. No, that doesn't mean that a far larger percentage believe in God with less certainty. Many Jews merge their beliefs in Judaism and Buddhism in a sort of syncretistically, syncretistically. Half of us are intermarried. It would be important to make a principle of this covenant a commitment to the idea that God's faith, if you believe in God at all, is not a single face. And our worship of God can reflect various beliefs in who and what God is and in methodology of practice. And I'll just be honest, although I gain a lot from Shabbat services when I go, I feel more of a spiritual connection in my daily meditation, which I actually just, really revel in every day. Since I've been 10 years old, I have believed in a God that lives as a light that's inside of me and every other human being. As a Jewish boy in a Jewishly conservative home in Dallas, I shared that belief with only a few people who asked me to keep it quiet. But I still believe it today. If we were to develop a covenant of learning, concepts of God would need to be included. In my view, if we did this, we could organize. I love that term because that's what I've done with much of my life. Bringing all three of the major progressive movements together to discuss how this could work and still keep whatever halakha, specific halakha each movement felt they needed, reform, conservative, and reconstructionism. And we can bring more minor ones and people who are not associated at all with any movement. In the teachings, we'd be able to tie in halakha as part of the learning, showing how halakha demanded that we love the Jewish people and care about the land of Israel and believe in justice for Jews and non-Jews and care deeply about the earth and much more. Halakha can be both an explicator and a validator of the values that the Jewish people in America have today. We don't have to teach them that halakha, they have to start there. They can get there and they can say, wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. My basic hope is that we go to the principal places where people live in their lives, and from those places find our values, bring in Jewish law and Jewish ritual as it is helpful, teach Agadah too, that's great, and teach the American basis of what we're studying. We can make this effort exciting and embracing. We can take our love of Judaism, which I know all of you have, and reach people in this age of autonomy exactly where they are and help them build their Jewish parts. That is not sacrilegious or anti-halakhic. Halakha's great too. If we look to values rather than Jewish law as our guide star, we can make Judaism a more dynamic and exciting place to be in the 21st century.
Yasher koach to both of you. That's wonderful. So much to talk about, not enough time, but we do have at least 25 minutes. I'll leave it to our speakers as to whether we're a little flexible. You'll tell me privately, maybe, in terms of the time. So to get right at it, in the interest of efficiency and a little bit of self-aggrandizement, I think I will try to give summary answers to a couple of the specific questions that have been posed. And then, as I say, I want to get into some of the bigger picture questions. And nicely, and not surprisingly, those big conceptual questions, I think, are coalescing around a couple of big issues. First of all, a relatively technical terminological issue, but Steve, you just touched on it too. And I'm going to give my view, and you can just, we'll move on unless either of you disagrees. Are the terms progressive and liberal being used interchangeably as to use in this discussion? I think Steve and I, at least, have both tended to call use progressive Jews to mean non-Orthodox Jews. That is pretty much clearly Reform and Reconstructionist. The trickiest player in all this is the evolving conservative movement, but I think he and I tend to call at least progressive Jews we really mean non-Orthodox Jews when we use that term. It doesn't necessarily say anything about your desire for rapid progressiveness or particular forms of adherence to any political progressiveness, but non-Orthodox, and therefore with a different approach to halakha than the Orthodox have, almost by definition, but also keeping in mind that there is, within the conservative movement, I would claim, as in the Reform and Reconstructionist movement, a folk elite divide that is substantial. But it seems to me there's a very big difference, because although the Reform movement does have and has had a very important to academics and other intellectuals Responsa Commission functioning for many, many years. Many of us know Mark Wachowski and other leading halachic advocates within the Reform movement. The fact is, in terms of the I would say respect, not in a, that's a loaded term, but the respect given to the work of responsa committees, and the Reconstructionist movement doesn't have one, although I long advocated for one personally. They don't have one. But the attention and respect given to the Conservative Committee on Law and Standards is really of a different order of magnitude than in the reform movement, unless Rachel disagrees with me. I'm talking about in the field. And more, I think the gap in the conservative movement is between the elite, the faculty of JTS, say, and other leaders in the RA and the field. Maybe in some ways the conservative movement is part of the one way of potentially oversimplifying the story is there's the growing gap between the elite perception of some of these issues or take on some of these issues and the take in the pews that has longer existed in the reform and Reconstructionist movements. I think mostly in the reform movement. Historically, I think the Reconstructionist movement had less of that gap. If we can move on.
I differ, Dan?
Oh, go ahead, unless you want to comment.
Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to, well, I'm sorry to say I agree with most of what you said.
Yeah,
Certainly Borowitz, and my use is based on Borowitz's use of liberal Judaism, meaning precisely non-Orthodox, but he meant it specifically in the context of postmodern Judaism. But I do want to say that we don't have to do it now, Dan, but I think there's a bit of a debate to be had about what you just said.
which part of it? You mean the conservative movement or the whole thing?
No, the whole thing for sure, okay. But because I love to argue with you. No, seriously, about the extent of the gap, the extent of the gap in the different denominations. And I, as long as I'm speaking, I have to say one more thing, which is Borowitz's goal since 1961, when he first started writing about and coined the term, really, covenant theology, is that it was specifically in order to respond to a world in which the two main choices of either being halachic or functioning and responding to everything in a halachic context, or responding to everything in a, in an ethics, what we would call social justice, right, ethical monotheism mode, that really there was a need for a new mode of thinking.
Right. So that takes us right into Mark Matchin, and speaking also from Manny Solon, has asked for Rachel, what does Borowitz say about our counterparty in a legal covenant? You said, quote, covenant with or within freedom, close quotes, but I'm not sure you meant that definitively. Is there any vertical component, to borrow Dan's language, or is the covenant horizontal with other Jews or other people, or is it something metaphysical?
Well, I'm so glad that we have this question on the table, because that specific question is really important in Borowitz's theology, and I certainly wouldn't want to in any way give the wrong impression about his theology. He really he conframes his theology ultimately in what he calls 5 premises of Jewish duty, and I think I'll just share at least one of them, if I might. For our context, which is that this Jewish self, the autonomous Jewish self, lives in covenant. Here we go. The Jewish self lives personally. This is the first of his 5 premises of Jewish duty. The Jewish self lives personally and primarily in involvement with the one God of the universe. Postmodernity has a more realistic view of our human capacities, right? So saying it's not a modern view of the human being as being able to be the source of our salvation, to use Kaplan's term, but he says that, what he says here is that we have a determination not to confuse the junior with the senior partner in that covenant. That's one answer to the question. But he says something very profound that, and this is having spent, a certain amount of time with David Hartman of blessed memory, Yitz Greenberg, may he live a long life, Elie Wiesel, right? All these, Emil Fackenheim, all these great thinkers, they're thinking together in the late 50s in particular. And Borowitz emerges from that saying that God was not hung at Auschwitz, right, and drawing on that image of Wiesel's work. But what's hanging in the gallows at Auschwitz is the false messiah of modernity. The false messiah of modernity. is really what died in that and was annihilated in that period. And so what we're living now in this postmodern reality, he says, is an understanding of God as being essential because of the failures of modernity and of human beings. Because where did all that, ethical monotheism and focus on the human capacities of modernity? It led us, onto trains to Auschwitz, or from an American's perspective to Hiroshima. And so he really wanted to bring a deep, clearly a very powerful and absolute notion of God into the equation.
Great. So the next group of questions more or less line up under the rubric of what I'd call post-halachic Judaism, or a post-halachic form of Judaism. I ventured in the publicity materials for this program that most, maybe the vast majority of liberal Jews today who think about these things at least, believe that they are participants in a post-halachic form of Judaism. This term has always, since it came into currency, has troubled me greatly. I think it's used vaguely often. I think it means different things to different people. And I want to get into that with both of you right now. So let's start though with at least one aspect of that, and that is the vexing question of sanctions. And this is something, I'll say I posted a link, again, self-aggrandizingly, to my own article on this subject. But of course, the primary challenge to those of us who have argued for liberal forms of what we want to call halacha, with or without a capital H, is that sanctions are, as descriptively, not normatively, sanctions are meaningless today. And that's, to them, I think, a primary meaning of post-halachic. Like it or not, there's nothing you can do about enforcement. So it's now meaningless or worse to call something a law or a binding rule. My answer, which I want reactions to, which I'm not the only one who's given it, but I've tried to argue it and I've taken a lot of flack for it, is no, we really do have largely, in fact, the same sanctions we've always had. And I'll use the word that gets me in big trouble. One is shaming or guilt. I think that's how a lot of this stuff always functioned, and to the extent communities want it to, and in some, of course, more traditional communities, it does still work that way. You don't need, in other words, I think, a Beit Din literally with the power of herem, of excommunication or expulsion, to get there. Although I do think communities do have the power at some point, and Steve, you touched on it with the notion, it's the example that's always used, particularly with the RRC admissions office, and that is the Messianic Jew. How far does this go? Is there not at some point a rule that says you are out? That's a lot to talk about, but starting with you, Steve, reactions to this notion of post-halachic. You probably disagree with me on the question of sanctions, or at least you don't like my sanctions, I would guess, but that's the question. Could we have one?
No, I actually think sanctions play a role if you don't make them both. If you don't make that there's a clear punishment. I mean, sanctions can be shaming. Let me just give you an example. When I was running a Jewish public policy organization, and this was probably in like 2012, 13, 14, we got 200 organizations to sign on to a very Jewish organization, to sign on to something very clear, very Jewish, about civility and not attacking people falsely. And we had Saul Berman, we had a lot of people helping design this, and they all read it, they argued about it, and then people would just break it, and there wasn't anything that we could do. I mean, we're not going to tell I'm not going to name the organizations, but they're huge, that they're no longer in the Jewish community, or that. So I mean, I think it was good to have it, and it's still there. The signatures are still on it. But I don't think in today's world, I mean, I think we really misjudge autonomy when we think we can do more than we can do. And I think, as you said, Dan, I'm actually agreeing with you. I don't think we can sanction, but we can shame. And even that doesn't do too much anymore in the present world. But I'd like to keep doing it when it's deserved.
Rachel, your thoughts?
Yeah. I want to respond to that question of consequences, because I would agree. I hate to do it again, Dan. I'm doing it again. I'm agreeing with you that there are sanctions. They're just different than cherem. We see you, Mel. Hang on a second, okay? they're just, they're different. I love to talk about Kaplan's excommunication. And of course, I think it was you, Dan, who recently put forward the Einstein's response to that, which is he didn't want to sign on to, I guess, essentially a letter. Was that you, Mel, who posted it? A letter protesting that excommunication because it would give them too much power, the RCA or the Rabbinic Council as it was. So I find that, maybe it's in your third volume. Anyway, I find that to be incredibly important in terms of how we understand this question of sanctions, which is sanctions can only come from an authority that you give that authority to, right? But what we all know, and I actually personally have experienced it, is, if you, and I've been on all sides of this, right? If you cross a law, the sanctions in today's world, if you cross some standard of practice, politically or otherwise, and this, my experience has been, if you push a Title IX issue, the consequences are you get fired. If you take a stance about Israel, the wrong stance at the wrong time, right, on these political issues, these sound political, but I see them as a way in which we understand how standards are enforced, right? My colleagues don't speak as much about Israel or immigrants or name candidates or refer to issues around immigration because we know that there will be consequences. Whether or not our rabbinic organizations are the ones who can give those consequences, they do, thankfully, now when it comes to different issues around sexual harassment. They do when it comes to financial issues, right? Our ethics committees are very busy with those sanctions. And so while I'm speaking about how that happens just for rabbis, I think it happens across the board. I think people are not given aliyot. The humanist movement, like your messianic, not like, but in comparison to your messianic example in the Reconstructionist world, the humanist synagogues that have asked for membership in the URJ have been denied it. So there are other ways, I think, of enforcing standards.
Great. Alan Scalt asks, doesn't halacha involve conscience in a way that guidance, and he's putting quotes around each of those three words, doesn't? I'm thinking, he writes, of conscience here as imposing a kind of obligation that guidance doesn't. Rachel and then Steve.
That halacha is more than guidance? I'm not sure.
He's saying that the role of a source of obligation could be outside of a traditional notion, I think is how I'm reading this, of commandment, and maybe line up better with some notion of halacha, because again, my firm belief, I assume most people's, is halacha does not, except with a very capital H, does not imply a belief or firm belief in a commanding God necessarily. But it does imply law or rules beyond guidance or suggestion. And I think what Alan's pointing at is the question, I think it was what he's asking is, that guidance seems to leave out the notion of the conscience, which is his term, providing a thick form of obligation beyond guidance. Maybe I just answered the question. I don't know.
No, that's what I actually think is happening in the Borowitzian mode on this question, which is that they're functioning, and I'm going to share with you a Venn diagram to help us understand it. They are the conscience, which really, and from the 1960s becomes understood as the self, and understood that way by writers and thinkers in the conservative movement as well. This notion of the self having some authority is about, in my view, it's at a post-Kantian, a post not neo-Kantian, but post-Kantian way of understanding that question of the conscience. And what Borowitz does is he suggests that these three categories that I'm about to share of God, and the Jewish people, past, present, and future, which is where halacha sits for him, because it's largely a product of, can you see this here? Whoops.
Mhm.
Yes. Because it's a product of the Jewish people, right? So let's say, God is this uppermost, you can see my cursor, I hope, right? The uppermost one. And we're in covenant with God, which is, covenant is not a suggestion. It's not guidance. It's something that is compelling. And then there's all the guidance of the Jewish people, past, present, and future. And for him, that's includes everything that has been brought down by our sages. And also are thinking about the current situation, which Steve was primarily focused on, and what it will mean for the future, which is part of why Borowitz was standing firm against officiating at intermarriages, right? Not because he thought that intermarriages today, and it might not be serving the Jewish people of today to give them, to preside over them and give them Jewish status, but because of what that might mean for the Jewish people in the long term and status questions going forward. And then the bottom one is the self, which is the conscience, that no human being alive today, whatever their self-definition is, as a Jew, as you said, Dan, no human being alive today is functioning, and maybe ever was functioning without autonomy. The first Jew ever does it by the next chapter, right? Between chapters 12 and 16 and 18 of Genesis, Abraham goes from being totally submissive to arguing with God. Thank God.
Great. Steve, you can respond to any of that, the most recent stuff as well. But before you do, I just want to throw in, there's sort of a pointed question that's been asked of you in terms of, maybe you can correct any misunderstanding of what you meant to say, but that your discussion of values seemed to focus, and I'm paraphrasing, but slightly quoting, current newspaper headlines, what's going on in the world today, particularly in terms of social justice. And is what I think the commenter is getting at is there a risk here that we lose, first of all, a connection to a bigger picture and a long history if we are too much involved in almost defining Judaism? But again, it may not be a correct reading of what you said in terms of current takes on social justice.
Well, I think that's not, I mean, I don't know who asked you, but I don't think it's a very good recalling of what I said, because if you think of what I brought up, first was the love of the Jewish people. Second was being kind and caring to the Jewish people. First was actually the Holocaust, and the idea that is something that's paramount. There was one or two things that had to do with more universalistic values, and I did mention them, but they were the reason I mentioned wasn't because I believe in them, I do, but because, the vast majority of 3,400 Jews, which was also supposed to be relatively, because pollsters don't just take one group, representatives said that this was what made them want to be Jewish. This was their value of their Jewishness. This is what they got from Judaism. So I'm not trying to. I don't think we should ever use our politics to try to define our Judaism. I just don't, and I've tried very hard over the decades not to do that. But I do think that if we hear that that's what, I was smiling. I had read that survey deck several years ago, but I hadn't reread it until preparing for this, and I went, that's nice. That's really nice. So that's my answer. And I guess in response to the question, I really do. I think when we spent that time, the reason I brought up that thing about the civility pledge that people is, these were all Jews. These were all people that took their Judaism seriously. Nobody was going to give us any sanctions of any sort. And so I felt like, yes, I wish there were, but we wouldn't have had anybody sign it if they had to follow sanctions. So I think we need to look at what we are today and build a Judaism, which is a wonderful, wonderful palette to put our Jews on, but figure out who they are and how they can sit in a Jewish place. That's what I'm saying. I'm not. If it was something different, I'm not like, hell bent that what I'm saying is right. I just think it is right. I mean, I wish it wasn't. I wish there wasn't so much autonomy maybe as a Texan, I'm glad there is, but there's some other parts of me don't. But there just is. It's not going to change. It's not. Anyway, I'm sorry. That's me.
No, that's great. I'm going to open the Mel Sculp's microphone in just a second, but before I do, did you have anything you wanted to add before we turn to Mel on Kaplan, to anything Rachel said, or in terms of responses to prior questions? No need, just asking.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, so Mel, you now can unmute yourself.
Well, the point is that in this volume and in the 15,000 pages, not that I have read every single page and know every single page of Kaplan's diary, there really is very little that Kaplan deals with the issue of specific behavior. It just didn't occupy him. What he said was very simply, there should be a unity of purpose. In other words, he looked for a kind of maximalism, but that maximalism would be different for different congregations and different people. He did not expect that there would be uniformity. In the present volume, which is out and which is available, he deals very clearly with the issue of halakha in one particular entry in 1942. And what he says is the following. He says, we need ritual and worship as a means of spiritual expression, but in fostering them, we should exercise spontaneity and creativity. There should be no definite binding laws to regulate the forms they are to take, since in the last analysis, they are man's grasping and attempts to articulate his yearning for communion with God. That's a very clear statement, but it is otherwise with principles of justice.
Mel, I'm going to push back, as I always do. So one, I tried to be very clear at the beginning that we have to distinguish in Kaplan between ritual guidance and non-ritual guidance. Two, 6 years after that diary entry, he published in a relatively lengthy chapter of The Future American Jew the following: no Jew who experiences in his own being anything of his people's will to live should accept with equanimity this defunct state of Jewish law. He himself, sorry about the gendered language, should do something or persuade others to do something about it. He is clearly not referring to ritual uniformity, which he does not believe is possible. But you know as well as, and better than anybody, he spent a good deal of the 50s and 60s advocating for the creation of a world Sanhedrin that would be democratically elected and create as a legal thing a new constitution for the Jewish people. So I completely agree with you about his statements about ritual uniformity, question whether sometimes it's descriptive versus normative, but he was obsessed with the broader notion of Jewish law to the point where at least one of his grandchildren had said he was crazy about it.
That issue of the larger organization of the Jewish people comes up, you're absolutely right, in his later years. And it has been completely disregarded by the Reconstructionist movement, the idea of a convention of the Jewish people and so on and so forth. Kaplan is a person who, for the better or for worse, stands on many sides of many issues. And that's particularly the case with God. But it's also the case here with the law. I'm not denying what he says in The Future of the American Jew. I'm just saying that it was one moment. And in the diary particularly, which goes over many, many years and many, many entries, he doesn't spend a great deal of time thinking. He's not obsessed with that issue of Jewish law. The matter of the way in which the community needs to be organized is a problem. And that's really what he's addressing in The Future of the American Jew. Who should be a member of the community, and should the community have the right to exclude people, and so on and so forth.
I think he's also talking about business ethics. He is very strong on the question from the 20s on of business ethics,
Well,
not just organization. But we will have to
right,
continue.
right.
This is a debate.
His goal, he talks about a uniformity of goal, and his goal was to contribute to the fulfillment of the individual and of the community. And that ought to be the guiding principle that he considered.
Can I say one thing, Dan?
Sure.
First of all, Mel, thank you. I felt reinforced by what you said, even if you didn't mean to. And I also really love the work you've done over so many years. So it's an honor to be on a call that you're on. I just wanted to go over, just because I think it will show how people see what they want to see. I said, when I went through, I just looked back to see those things that are essential to being Jewish. Those things that are essential, this is for all American Jews. Remembering the Holocaust, leading an ethical and moral life, observing Jewish law, it was small, but it was there. Living or caring about Israel, working for equality and justice, that was the only one that could be set to be not Jewishly set, eating Jewish food and having a good sense of humor. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is I don't think any of those things said that most Jews want to be universalists. I think they want to be Jews, but they showed where they think Jewish teaching and their Jewish life brings them. That's all.
Great. With that, I'm sorry we are out of time. I just want to take a moment to thank again our wonderful speakers, Rachel Shabbat Beit-Lachmi and Steve Guto. To be continued. There's lots more to discuss. And again, watch the emails, because we'll start with the program on the diaries. That was a good segue, Mel. We will pick up with that volume of diaries a week from Monday. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, as the case may be. Take care.